In this video, I will tell you about the trim and extend command of AutoCAD. So let's select the trim tool from the modify panel, and here we have this trim tool. You can also expand the flyout and select the trim tool. Now after selecting the trim, simply press enter, and now click on the segment which you want to remove. So in this case, we have made all of these objects with rectangle, which is a polyline, and let's now assume that we want to remove some of the segment. For example, we want to remove this segment from this boundary to this boundary. So now when I move my cursor on this segment, the transparency of this segment increases and it becomes dull, and also a preview is shown that shows the part which will be trimmed. So let's click and the part is trimmed. Now let's move to this part, and here also it will be trimmed from this boundary to this boundary. In a similar way, you can click on any part of this geometry. For example, if you click here, it will trim this object from this boundary to this corner. And similarly, you can trim this part, and you can keep on trimming as long as there is a boundary. Now here also you can click here, and that will trim the geometry from this corner to this corner. Now let's press escape key, and this trim tool is helpful not only for trimming these line segments, but it can trim arcs, circles and other geometries also. So basically all of the geometries can be trimmed using the trim tool. So now let's press Ctrl Z a couple of times to get the original geometry here. So now let's select the trim tool and let's look at other method of trimming the objects. So now I'll select the trim, and once again I'll simply press enter. Now after pressing enter, look at the command line, and it now prompts you to select from multiple options. So let's select fence. In the previous case, we have not selected any of these options, but in this case, I'll select the fence option. And now using the fence option, you can create fences, and all the parts which are crossed by the fence will be trimmed. For example, you can see that the line segment is crossing that fence, so it has been trimmed. This part is also trimmed. So let's now click here. Let's trim this one also. Let's trim this fence, and let's trim this one, and let's trim this one. So now you can see that all the line segments which are crossed by this fence are trimmed. Simply press enter to apply the change, and here we have it. So all of those segments are now trimmed. So let's press escape key, and let's press Ctrl Z to get back the original geometry. Now let's go to the trim tool again, and now don't press enter. So in the previous cases, we have directly pressed enter, and by pressing enter, we have selected all of the objects in the drawing area. And by selecting the objects, we were essentially allowing the trim tool to trim objects with the very next boundary. But in this case, we can select the boundaries which will be selected for trimming. So let's assume that we want to trim our objects only with respect to this red boundary. So I'll select this red object and now press enter. Now when you click on the objects, it will only be trimmed up to the red boundary. So here we have this white rectangle. So let's now click on this portion here, and now you'll notice that the complete portion will be removed, which is outside this red rectangle. Similarly, if you click on this one, the complete portion which is outside this rectangle is removed. If you select the green rectangle, the complete portion which is inside this red rectangle is removed, and if you select this yellow one, there will not be any change because it's completely inside. It's not touching the boundary here of this red rectangle. But in this case, it will be trimmed. In this case, it will not be trimmed. Now in this case, you can see that we don't have any boundary, any object outside this red box, and that is why it's a single segment and that cannot be trimmed. So let's now press escape key, and let's press Ctrl Z a couple of times to get back the original geometry. In trim tool, you can trim any object as long as there is a boundary. So if you create an object, let's say that we create this 3-point arc somewhere inside this object here, just like this, and we want to trim this object. So this will only be trimmed if a next boundary is found. So let's select the trim tool, press enter, and now I'll click somewhere inside this geometry and I'll click this part, and the part has been removed. Now let's click on this part, and let's click on this part. Now if you click on this part, it won't be trimmed because there is no boundary after that. So we have this one as the last boundary. After that, we don't have any boundary. Now let's click on this part here, and now we have these two segments here. So let's now click on this part here. And now this is once again a completely single segment with no boundary. So here we have a boundary, but we don't have any object on this side. Here we also have a boundary, but we don't have any object. So this is a single segment and it won't be trimmed. Similarly, for all the remaining segments also, the same rule applies. So let's press Escape key and Control Z a couple of times. The extend tool is completely opposite of this trim tool, and it will extend the geometries to the next boundary. So for selecting the extend tool, I'll make a line here just like this, and also I'll make a 3-point arc. Now go to this flyout and select the extend tool. Now once again press enter, and that will select all the objects in the drawing area, and wherever the next boundary is found, the object will be extended. So in this case, I'll click on this line and you'll notice that it will be extended up to the next boundary, which is the arc here. And now I'll click here. Once again, it's extended to next boundary, to next boundary, and to next boundary, and the same system will follow. If you select on this arc, it will also extend to the next boundary, but if you click on it now, there will not be any change because it cannot extend and it cannot make a complete circle. Now let's press Escape and Control Z once again. Now let's say that in this case also we want to select a particular boundary for the extend tool. We can do that. So I'll select the extend tool again, and now I'll select this yellow boundary and press enter. Now click on this line and you'll notice that it will bypass all the extra geometries which are present before this yellow rectangle. So it will directly extend the object up to this yellow object, and it will bypass these 3 geometries. Now if you click on this again, it will extend it up to the next boundary of this yellow rectangle, and it will bypass both of these objects. So by making a selection for extend, you can create extended geometries which behave in a particular way. So let's press Escape key and Control Z a couple of times. The trim and extend tool can be used using a single command also. So in the previous case, we saw that we can toggle this trim and extend tool from the flyout, but you can select the trim tool and use it for extending the object. So right now you can see that I've selected the trim tool, but now I'll press enter, and now I'll simply press and hold my shift key. So pressing and holding the shift key will change the command to its next counterpart. And now I'll click on this line segment, and now you can see that it's extending it even though we have the trim command active, and the similar condition will apply on the extend tool as well. So let's press Escape key and get back to the original geometry, and I'll also erase both of these objects. So this was all about the trim and extend tool of AutoCAD.